I'm Larry Waters, Vice President of the John Birch Society, and it's delightful to have good to have such a distinguished crowd. We appreciate all of you being here. Our first speaker is from Boston, or Boston as they say it up there, Mr. John McManus. I've known Jack for many years, and he's done an outstanding job in every job he's had. He joined the Society in 1966. He does laud the fact that he came on the staff before me by 1 year. I came on in 67, but I'll simply point out that I joined in 61 and ask what took him so long to join. Anyway, Jack has done a great job of everything he's done. Mr. Welch appointed him to be the first Director of Public Affairs for the Society. In this post, he became the Society's chief representative to the media. He's appeared on hundreds of radio and television shows, including C-SPAN, Larry King Show, Glenn Beck, recently you may have heard, and the Pat Buchanan Show. He's one of the few authorized spokesmen for the Society. Jack has written and produced numerous visual aid programs. He's in wide demand as a speaker. His books that he's written include Financial Terrorism, Changing Commands, The Betrayal of America's Military, William F. Buckley, Pied Piper for the Establishment, and The Insiders, which has gone through 5 editions now. In addition to being a regular contributor to the New American, he also serves as its publisher. He was named president of the Society in 1991. Born in 1935 in Brooklyn, New York, he is a graduate of Holy Cross College. He served on active duty as a lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps for 3 years. For 6 years before coming on our staff, he served as an electronics engineer. The father of 4 and grandparent of several, Mr. McManus has been married to the former Mary Helen O'Reilly of Boston since 1957. Let's give a big Texas welcome to Mr. Jack McManus.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Larry. I'm supposed to be speaking tonight about correcting fallacies. Now, any discussion of fallacies will likely lead to a discussion of various anomalies in the English language, and there are plenty of these pesky anomalies in our language. For instance, if the people from Poland are called Poles, shouldn't we call the people from Holland holes? We know that lawyers can be disbarred and clergymen can be defrocked. Now, in keeping with this tradition, therefore, shouldn't electricians be delighted? Cowboys deranged? Models deposed? And dry cleaners depressed? I had some fun years ago when I started a little group called the Society for the Restoration of Lost Positives. Now, lost positives are words that don't exist, even though there's a negative form of the word. For example, a man who is totally organized is never called combobulated. Now, even though a sad person can be labeled disgruntled, you've never heard of a very satisfied individual being described as gruntled. And anyone can be uncouth or unkempt, but no one is just plain couth or kempt, right? Now, years ago, I told Robert Welsh about my search for lost positives, and because he enjoyed playing around with words, he joined my group. In the very next JBS monthly bulletin, he wrote about his good friend Meldrum Thompson, the governor of New Hampshire, who was a member of the John Birch Society. He called Governor Thompson the most shoveled man I have ever known. I had created a monster. Another interesting feature of the language we use is the need to be precise when speaking. I love to tell the story about the Irish cop who patrolled the streets of New York City back in the 1960s. And this, of course, was a time when there were a lot of demonstrations going on and a lot of fisticuffs and everything else. He was on duty when one of the frequent communist demonstrations was being held. assigned with many other cops to make sure there wouldn't be any trouble, he took his job very seriously. And sure enough, after the communists had fired up the crowd, there was a melee. The cops rushed into the midst of the trouble and started clubbing one right after the other. The Irish cop I mentioned started clubbing this one fellow who pleaded, "Why are you hitting me? I'm an anti-communist." And the cop said, "I don't care what kind of a communist you are," and he hit him again. But my assignment here tonight is to correct current fallacies, so let's get a little bit serious. This is a serious subject. The first fallacy I want to obliterate is that our nation benefits greatly from a vibrant system of public schools. Ladies and gentlemen, they aren't public schools, they are government schools. When you explain to anyone that our nation's founders gave us a republic, not a democracy, that's another fallacy, by the way, and you explain the difference, you'll find people wondering why this isn't taught in the so-called public schools. The answer is very simple. The government schools are never going to teach anything that will erode government power. Now, that's very simple. The government schools won't teach what will undermine the power of government. They won't teach about republics versus democracies. They won't teach the truth about inflation because the government has partnered with the Federal Reserve to erode the value of the currency by flooding our nation with unbacked dollars. And these dollars steal the worth of everyone's dollars, diminish the value of savings, insurance policies, and everything else. Always remember what the late Gary Allen stated. He said, if you believe inflation is rising prices, then you also believe that wet streets cause rain. In short, the government schools are a plague that all of us are forced to support. I know that occasionally there's a decent teacher who provides solid information, but most don't, and most don't because they themselves are victims of the government schools. At the time of our nation's founding, there were no government schools. People learned to read and write at their mother's knee or with a local clergyman. The Federalist Papers, written to explain the Constitution, were read and understood by the supposedly uneducated farmers of New York State. Now, you likely know that the writings of Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in the Federalist Papers are not dumbed-down prose. Right? Occasionally, a single sentence fills the page. I've encountered college graduates of the government schools who find the Federalist Papers too difficult to read. These products of government education don't know anything about the basic roots of their country, and they have been repeatedly told that they've received a good education at the hands of the government. And so I salute the growth of the homeschool movement and the private school movement and the John Birch Society summer camp program for teens. Anything that circumvents the government school system is good, but let's point out that it is a total fallacy to refer to these schools as public. They do not benefit the public, they benefit the government that has taken them over. The next fallacy is that if you want our nation to mind its own business, if you want the troops home from undeclared wars, if you want our leaders to cease forcing democracy on other peoples and other lands, you will be labeled an isolationist. That's the response you'll get from liberals and know-nothings. A good response to that is to say, I'm not an isolationist. I'm a non-interventionist with your son, your daughter, and your wallet. The founders urged commercial relations with all, entangling alliances with none. They also said not to go to war unless attacked, and never to go to war without a formal declaration by Congress. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's not isolationism, that's good sense. And on the subject of war, another fallacy holds that the current war was actually declared by Congress. No, it wasn't. Both houses passed a measure giving the president their blessing if he wanted to start a war. That's different. If a formal declaration of war had been issued, there would have been an enemy nation or region named as the enemy, not a tactic. Here we are in the 5th year of going to war against terrorism, which is a tactic. And our borders remain wide open with virtually nothing being done to close them, and every opportunity for any terrorist to come across that border. Another pernicious fallacy holds that we need a Federal Reserve to manage the money system. Now, you tell someone that you want the Fed abolished and be prepared for insistence that someone has to manage the money. My friends, honest money is a commodity. It doesn't need management. History tells us that such commodities as shells, tobacco, cattle, even nails filled past needs for money, a medium of exchange. But history, not some economic guru, also tells us that gold and silver are the best commodities for use as money. Speaking of economists, I recall hearing a fellow say one time, he said, if all the economists in the world were laid end to end, that would be fine. Now, the importance of understanding that money should be a commodity is that commodities do not need to be managed. Basketballs are a commodity, sneakers, potted plants, tires, cans of soup, computers are not managed. Gold and silver are commodities that also don't have to be managed. Their attributes, value to all, divisibility, transportability, durability, and relative scarcity, make them best suited to use as money. They don't have to be managed because the impersonal marketplace will demonstrate their value and make them useful as mediums for exchange. Robert Welsh once stated that there has never been honesty in the management of money in all history. That's profound. I greatly fear he was correct about that. We who live in this wonderful country that we're trying to preserve are victims of one of the greatest examples of managed money in all history, the Federal Reserve. Try to remember that when the supposed need to have some economic gurus manage the money system, and remember that it's one of the greatest fallacies of all time. One more fallacy, and then I'll quit. I would bet that every person in this room has been told that the job of the Supreme Court is to interpret the Constitution, right? You've been told that, right? Ladies and gentlemen, that is the fallacy of fallacies. It is not the job of the Supreme Court or any other court to interpret the Constitution. It's the job of the black-robed judges to obey the Constitution, to adhere to its limitations on government, and especially at the Supreme Court level, to decide that many of the matters before them do not fall under their jurisdiction and should promptly be handed back down to the states and to the people themselves. Judges swear an oath to the Constitution that was written and approved 220 years ago. Until that document is amended, it is the supreme law of the land. And it must be understood according to the understanding of the people who wrote it and the language they employed in 1787. Otherwise, why write it down? Swearing an oath to the Constitution is precisely similar to signing a contract. Once a contract is signed, does anyone think it should be interpreted? No. It should be adhered to. Should its clauses be turned on their head by one party or the other? No. Should the contract be ignored and business conducted according to whim or fancy? Of course not. The contract has conditions that must be honored, and it is written in language understandable to both parties. It can be altered by interpretation? No, it can't be altered by interpretation. Unless this is the case, why have a contract? After he became president, Thomas Jefferson addressed this very point when he said the following: "The Constitution on which our Union rests shall be administered by me according to the safe and honest meaning contemplated by the plain understanding of the people of the United States at the time of its adoption." Could that be more clear? Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. He later emphasized the point again when he said, "On every question of construction, let us carry ourselves back to the time when the Constitution was adopted, recollect the spirit manifested in the debates, and instead of trying what meaning can be squeezed out of the text or invented against it, conform to the probable one in which it was passed." Wonderful. Wonderfully good sense. Jefferson didn't believe that the Constitution should be interpreted, and neither do I. He didn't believe that the Constitution sent out penumbras beyond its obvious meaning. You know the word penumbra? Penumbra, it's an object's emanation, a shadow, not the object itself. And the Supreme Court actually used the word penumbra to justify the Social Security system in the 1930s, and another group of learned justices discovered penumbras in the Constitution to rule in 1973's Roe v. Wade decision. Penumbras. Right. Let me provide an easily understandable example of the departure from the clear meaning of the Constitution. Consider its very first sentence. Article 1. Section 1, Sentence 1, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. That's pretty clear. All lawmaking power belongs in Congress, the legislative branch. But haven't you heard it said, and probably heard it frequently, that a Supreme Court decision is the law of the land? You've heard that. How can that be? If all lawmaking power is granted to Congress, how can that be? Does the word all still have any meaning? You've likely also heard that executive orders handed down by one president after another that take on the force of law when published in the Federal Register. You've heard that. The Environmental Protection Agency was created by an executive order issued by Richard Nixon, not by Congress. How can this be when the very first sentence in the Constitution says it's impossible? Well, that first sentence also states that the only laws that Congress can create are herein granted. Herein where? Herein within the pages of this big, voluminous document. Right? No, it's not voluminous, right? I define anyone to find power to dispense foreign aid herein granted. Or to find power for the federal government to be involved in education, housing, medicine, human services, and a host of other bureaucratic nightmares. The Constitution has been interpreted not only by the Supreme Court, but also by Congress. If they won't adhere to its limitations, it's as if it didn't exist. They do obey the portion that says they shall receive a compensation for their services. Yes, they honor that sentence. Jefferson said that the honest meaning of its words should prevail, and all attempts to squeeze something out of its true meaning should be rejected. And later, Chief Justice Roger Taney would later agree with Jefferson when he stated, "Any other rule of construction would make the Constitution the mere reflect of the popular opinion or passion of the day." Well, you see why I get upset about the fallacy about Supreme Court should interpret the Constitution. The good news is that the Constitution still stands. Attempts to revise and destroy it have been thwarted, mainly through the tireless efforts of members of the John Birch Society who blocked the call for a constitutional convention. Because it still stands, we the people can insist that it be obeyed. And that's why we are here. That's why we are here this evening. To gather momentum so that the Constitution and all of its limitations on Big Brother shall be honored. It is a monstrous fallacy to hold that the Constitution should be interpreted. This is perhaps the most pernicious of all the fallacies that could be addressed by me or by anyone. And so let me close by assuring all of you that what I have stated in condemning these rampant fallacies are not being countered in the government schools. Thank you very much.